This is a second lecture on the book of Deuteronomy, and this lecture will flesh out the contents of Deuteronomy by elaborating on some theological themes in each of its sections. The first part of the book is the prologue, and in this prologue it emphasizes how God had been faithful. It reviews the history of Israel, showing how God had remained faithful throughout the 40 years of wilderness wanderings and even before that. And it's useful for us sometimes to review God's dealings in our lives, to be reminded that this is true of us as well. Then in Deuteronomy chapters 5 through 11, this is mostly a pep talk on the need to obey God's word. The Ten Commandments is repeated in this section in chapter 5. The Ten Commandments give a summary of the demands that God makes upon a people that are called by his name, that they are to put him first and to treat other human beings decently. Now, one of the major passages in this section is the passage Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 9, where it gives the famous Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And traditionally that's been translated, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. It's a part of a larger section. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. Again, this Shema is prayed 3 times a day by Orthodox Jews. Now, one of the questions that comes up, does the Shema contradict the doctrine of the Trinity? Orthodox Jews will quote this verse, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, as if it were a denial of the doctrine of the Trinity. But there can be a complicated unity, even where there are distinguishable parts. If you look at Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24, a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Well, there you have an example of 2 becoming 1. And so there can be a complex unity. God can be one, and yet God at the same time be triune in person. Well, one God, but 3 persons is the doctrine. Now, the Christian doctrine is not a denial of the oneness of God. The Trinity can be understood as a tri-unity, where even though there are 3 persons, they together constitute one God. But there is another way of answering the objection to the doctrine of the Trinity from the Shema, and that is in terms of translation. The NIV margin gives what I think is probably the better translation. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. This fits Hebrew grammar. The Hebrew word echad can be translated alone. It's done so in a number of contexts. And indeed, the word alone is related to the word one, even in English. Alone is derived from the compound of all one, so all one ended up being alone. And only is another way you could render it. And only comes from onely. Now, the translation, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, actually fits the historical and literary context rather well. It fits the context where the Decalogue commands Israel to have no other God besides me. Deuteronomy 5 and verse 7. In other words, the Shema arguably is a restatement of the first commandment of the Decalogue. And it also fits logically. It's illogical to call a person one. I mean, what would you say if I said, you are one? What else would a person be? And so it doesn't really make sense to call God one, but if you say the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, well, that makes perfectly good sense. Mark 12, verses 28 through 34 clarifies the Shema. A teacher of the law commented on it. "Well said, teacher," the man replied. "You are right in saying that God is one, and there is no other but him." Now, he just quoted this verse from Deuteronomy 6:4, and to say God is one means, according to the teacher of the law, there is no other but him. And so it's not really about the triune nature of God at all. It doesn't say anything one way or the other about whether God is complex in his unity or not. It is saying there is only one God. It's a statement of monotheism, not a denial of the doctrine of the Trinity, which had not yet been revealed. It's not really fully revealed until New Testament revelation. The Shema does tell us, though, of the importance of obeying God's word. As the passage follows, it emphasizes the need to teach God's word and to meditate on God's word at all times, at all places, and in various ways. When it says in verse 8 to tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads, the Pharisees use this as a basis for phylacteries. Those are boxes that you would put on your forehead that would have the Shema and other Bible verses in it. But I think it's probably not literal language, but hyperbole. In other words, do everything possible to keep God's word ever before you. This section of the book emphasizes that there is grace in the law, that Israel's election was based on love rather than merit. Deuteronomy 7, verses 7 and 8, "The Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other peoples, for you were the fewest of all peoples, but it was because the Lord loved you and kept his oath, which he swore to your forefathers, that he brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the land of slavery, from the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt." Likewise, Deuteronomy 9, verses 4 through 6, also quoted in the first lecture. "After the Lord your God has driven them out before you, do not say to yourself that the Lord has brought me here to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. No, it's on account of the wickedness of these nations." But then it repeats, it's not because of your righteousness. It's actually in spite of the fact that you're a stiff-necked people. Again, it's based not on their merit, but on God's grace. Jesus also used Deuteronomy, and it emphasizes the importance of obeying God's word. In the temptation narratives in Luke chapter 4 and the parallel in Matthew, Jesus freely applied some of the laws of Deuteronomy 5 through 11. For example, in Luke 4:4, he quotes from Deuteronomy 8 and verse 3 that God allowed Israel hardship to teach them that, quote, "Man does not live by bread alone, but every word that comes out of the mouth of God." He quotes this to the devil. Likewise, when he was told to worship Satan, he quotes from Deuteronomy 6 and verse 13 in Luke 4:8, where he says, "Fear the Lord your God and serve him only." And then when he was exhorted by Satan to throw himself off the pinnacle of the temple in Luke chapter 4 and verse 12, Jesus quotes from Deuteronomy 6 and verse 16, "Do not put the Lord your God to the test." And so by Jesus' own example, he shows the importance of listening to, understanding, and applying and obeying God's word. And this is one way to thwart the temptations of the devil. Now, in chapters 12 through 26, this is more specific regulations. You get lots of examples of God's law, things which Israel was exhorted to obey in some detail. For example, in Deuteronomy 12, but you are to seek the place where the Lord your God will choose from among all your tribes to put his name there for his dwelling. To that place you must go, and there you will bring your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tithes and special gifts that you have vowed to give, and your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks. There, in the presence of the Lord your God, you and your families shall eat and shall rejoice in everything that you have put your hand to, because the Lord your God has blessed you. You have positive encouragements to worship here and in other places. Worship is to be joyful. The sacrifices and tithes are to be offered in a way in which one rejoices before the Lord, chapter 12:7 and chapter 12, verse 12. There were occasions where they were to do that for the Feast of Tabernacles and the Feast of Weeks and the Feast of Booths. Those are the three pilgrim feasts mentioned in Deuteronomy 16 and verse 16. The tithes were used to support the Levites, Deuteronomy 18, 1 through 8. And their worship involved bringing first fruits and tithes to the Lord, Deuteronomy chapter 26. There were certain prohibitions regarding worship. They were not to engage in idolatry, Deuteronomy 13 and also 16:21 through 17:5. They were to avoid all forms of magic and divination, Deuteronomy 18, 9 through 13. And they were to avoid false prophecy, Deuteronomy 18, verses 14 through 22. They were to treat disadvantaged classes in a decent way. In Deuteronomy 24, it says this, verse 10, when you make a loan of any kind to your neighbor, do not go into his house to get what he is offering as a pledge. Stay outside and let the man to whom you are making the loan bring the pledge out to you. If the man is poor, do not go to sleep with his pledge in your possession. Return his cloak to him by sunset so that he may sleep in it. And then he will thank you, and it will be regarded as a righteous act in the sight of the Lord your God. So if his cloak is collateral for a loan, but it's really cold out, let him go ahead and have it that night. And that will be a blessing to both the man and to you. It says, do not take advantage of a hired man who is poor and needy, whether he is a brother Israelite or an alien living in one of your towns. Pay him his wages each day before sunset, because he is poor and is counting on it. Otherwise, he may cry out to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin. Again, with debtors and slaves and the poor, debts were to be canceled every 7 years. And debt slaves were set free after 7 years, as all found in Deuteronomy 15. And as the passage we just read said, one was not to enter his house arbitrarily to get a pledge for a loan, but out of compassion, one was to return the cloak of a poor man at night when it is cold, and to pay him his wages in a timely way. Other disadvantaged classes include sojourners and the fatherless and the widow, and these were all to be treated decently and allowed to glean fields as an act of charity. Deuteronomy 24, 17 through 22. In the book of Ruth and Naomi were allowed to glean fields in accord with this law. There's a law about a woman captured at war in Deuteronomy 21, verses 10 through 14. And at first glance, it seems to be an unfair law. When you go to war against your enemies and the Lord your God delivers them into your hand and you take captives, if you notice among the captives a beautiful woman and are attracted to her, you may take her as your wife. Bring her into your home and have her shave her head and trim her nails and put aside the clothes that she was wearing when captured. After she has lived in your house and mourned her father and mother for a full month, then you may go to her and be her husband, and shall be your wife. But if you are not pleased with her, let her go wherever she wishes. You must not sell her or treat her as a slave, since you have dishonored her. Well, this is probably talking about a non-Israelite woman captured in war. It wouldn't be a Canaanite, but it could be non-Canaanites that they could marry. She was told to shave her head and trim her nails. This would do two things. She was allowed to mourn her family for an entire month, but this also would have the effect of removing her beauty. What is a woman's beauty but her hair, the way she does her nails, or at least two ways that women can amplify their beauty. And the reason this guy wanted her was because she was attractive, she was beautiful. So the first thing it tells you to do is to remove her beauty, shave her head, cut her nails. And then you got to wait 30 days. On her part, it would give her some time to adjust to this new situation. On the guy's part, you might call this a cooling off period for the guy as he sees the stubble of hair growing out of her skull to think, do I really want to marry this particular woman? And if he goes ahead and marries her, he must treat her as a wife rather than a slave. A slave could be sold if you don't like her, but this woman, if she's taken as a wife, cannot be sold. She must be set free, just like a freeborn wife. Now, what's the purpose of this law, and how does it compare with how war normally was conducted both in ancient times and even in modern times? Well, in contrast with the standard operating procedure of war throughout history, which is you kill the men and then you rape the women, this was not to be allowed in Israel. If you see a captive woman and are attracted to her, you can't just rape her and leave her. You must marry her. And if you marry her, she must have full wifely privileges. And again, if you no longer like her as a wife, you have to set her free. And so the ultimate motive of this was a more humane treatment of women captives than would be the standard procedure in ancient times. Other laws have to do with justice and the rule of law. In terms of judges and witnesses, all bribe-taking and partiality was condemned. Rather, judges were to, quote, follow justice and justice alone as they conduct their duties. Perjury could result in a penalty on the liar as much as the penalty of the accused if the accused were found guilty on the basis of the lie. In other words, if you accuse a man of, say, murder, but you are deliberately lying about it, you could be condemned as a murderer because you were trying to get the man killed. Or if it were theft, it would be the penalty of theft. That's what Deuteronomy 19:16 through 21 teaches about the punishment for perjury in court. There's also an interesting law of the king. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself. But this way, by the way, assumes that someday there would be kings in Israel in accordance with certain messianic promises, like Genesis 49 and verse 10. He must not multiply horses for himself. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from what the priests, who are the Levites. It will is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and all these decrees, and not consider himself better than his brothers and turn from the law to the right or to the left. And then he and his descendants will reign for a long time over the kingdom in Israel. This is an interesting law limiting what kings were supposed to be able to do. Don't acquire a great number of horses, don't acquire a great number of wives, don't acquire a great deal of silver and gold. The kings mostly ignored that, especially Solomon, and yet it does give a moral idea of how the leaders were supposed to have conducted themselves. Kings were to obey God's word. They were not to abuse power by multiplying possessions. They were to be subservient to the divine king and his law. There's a term, lex rex, the law is king. Even kings are subject to the law of God in the Bible. There's rules of evidence in court. Deuteronomy 19 and verse 15 says, "One witness is not enough to convict a man accused of any crime or offense he may have committed. A matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses." In other words, there can be no punishment without solid evidence, 2 or 3 witnesses. Deuteronomy condemns abusive, arbitrary punishment on the basis of suspicion rather than evidence. Penalties cannot be imposed without collaborating evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, never just one. One could be lying. Now, there's also laws about the cities of refuge. It adjudicates between accidental manslaughter and intentional murder. You'll read about that in Deuteronomy 19. The intentional murderer could be put to death, but accidental manslaughter, in that case, a person could flee to the city of refuge and stay there until the death of the high priest. This was also talked about in Numbers chapter 35. A famous law is the lex talionis, called the law of retaliation. It's actually found in Deuteronomy 19:21, Exodus 21, verses 22 through 25, and Leviticus 24, 18 through 20. And it has that famous expression, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Now, lex talionis is not a license for revenge, as some Jews in Jesus' day misinterpreted it as being. It was rather meant as a limitation of punishment in judicial decisions. Only one life for the life taken, only one hand for the hand maimed. And it didn't preclude monetary equivalence. You could ransom your body parts rather than having them amputated. But what it was meant to do was to exclude all disproportional punishments. You don't get punished 10 measures for an offense of only 1 measure. There were also limits set on corporal punishments. It says in Deuteronomy 25, 1 through 3, that a person could suffer no more than 40 lashes as a corporal punishment. And this is out of respect for the dignity, even of criminals. You would demean the person if you punished them worse than 40 lashes. Another rule is that one is to punish the person, but not his family. Deuteronomy 24 and verse 16, fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their fathers. Each is to die for his own sin. There's also a whole chapter on the practice of just war in Deuteronomy 20. We'll discuss this passage in conjunction with the book of Joshua. There's a famous law of divorce in Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, And if, after she leaves his house, she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce and gives it to her and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband, who divorced her, is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon the land of the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. Now, this is along with many other sexual laws. For example, in Deuteronomy 22 and verse 5, men are not to wear women's clothing and women are not to wear men's clothing. So dressing in drag, transgender type behavior is prohibited by the law of Deuteronomy. Adultery is also condemned. False accusation of one's spouse is also covered, and the penalty for doing that in Deuteronomy 22:13 through 21. Rape is a capital offense if the woman was betrothed, though not otherwise. And then we have this law of divorce that we read. It allowed divorce in the case of some indecency. That some indecency might include adultery, could include adultery that might be proven in court if the man simply had compassion on his wife and chose not to press charges. Or it could be something that he knows it happened, but he can't prove it. But divorce would be allowed in such a case. It prohibits remarriage to the first husband if there is another marriage that intervenes in the meantime, which is contrary to what certain Christian counselors have recommended. We also have a passage on levirate marriage, which involves polygamy. A woman's husband dies before she has children. The brother of the husband could marry her to raise up an heir for the first husband's inheritance. That was a way of taking care of widows. Deuteronomy 28 goes into the blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience. If you fully obey the Lord your God and carefully follow all his commands I give you today, the Lord your God will set you high above the nations on earth. And all these blessings will come upon you and accompany you if you obey the Lord your God. You will be blessed in the city and blessed in the country. The fruit of your womb will be blessed, and the crops of your land, and the young of your livestock, the calves of your herds and lambs of your flock. Your basket and your kneading bowl will be blessed, and you will be blessed when you go out and blessed when you come in. This is part of that blessing and cursings section in Deuteronomy 27 and 28. And it emphasizes, again, obedience brings blessing, disobedience brings the curse. It goes on to say that in all the things that are mentioned, that if you disobey, you will be cursed. And ultimately, the curse would be expulsion from the land, Deuteronomy 28 and verse 64. And this theology of blessing and curse will be reflected in the historical books that follow, where when Israel obeyed, they tended to be blessed, but when Israel disobeyed, a curse follows. But the last part of the book, 29 through 34, does emphasize the covenant and that God is gracious in the end. It conveys Israel's renewal of the covenant. Heaven and earth is serving as witnesses of this covenant renewal. And the book concludes with an account of Moses' death in chapter 34. It shows grace in the end, Deuteronomy 30, verses 1 through 3. When all these blessings and curses I have set before you come upon you, and you take them to heart wherever the Lord your God disperses you among the nations. By the way, this assumes that they're going to disobey and going to be exiled. And when you and your children return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and all your soul, according to everything I command you today, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations. The Lord your God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your descendants, so that you may love him with all your heart and all your soul and live. Israel was destined to fail, to be disobedient, and to be expelled from the land. Deuteronomy 30 and verse 1. And yet God promises that they would be brought back to the land and their fortunes restored, verses 2 through 9. God even promised to circumcise their heart. Jeremiah and Ezekiel talk about the same sort of thing in Jeremiah 31 through 34, and Ezekiel 36, 24 through 27. That's in conjunction with the new covenant. And so the book ends with a note of grace that despite disobedience, the promise is going to continue, and God is going to continue to have a relationship with his people Israel because he is a gracious God. And so we reach the conclusion of the book. The whole book is a covenant renewal document. It renews the Mosaic covenant for a new generation, that generation that was born in the wilderness. And they renew the covenant which their ancestors had entered into some 40 years earlier. Christians, too, are also in a covenant relationship with God, a different covenant. We're under the new covenant. But we, too, from time to time, need to renew that relationship. And each new generation must reaffirm it. Well, that, I believe, is the highlights of the message of Deuteronomy. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle.